be. So Tracy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having the courage to tell your story. I think you're telling it today for the first time, but also thank you for giving us what we know is really precious time for you today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thank you for allowing me to tell my story. I want to start out by I started IVF, my journey in 2021 at age 45. I was in the middle, as you say, law school, juggling 2 jobs, trying to extend my family. Our clinic that my husband and I decided to use was in Syracuse, New York. It was over 1,000 miles away one way. We told no one until today, as you described. Um, we told no one because this was a private matter and it was a personal experience, and we just didn't want to, we chose not to tell anyone. I want to start out by telling you about the bonds and the experiences from the IVF clinic lobby. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about a lady that I met there in the IVF clinic lobby. She was in her late 50s. Well, her name was Susan, and Susan was there for her 4th transfer. Her odds were very low. Well, the first question when you're usually in the IVF clinic is, are you here for a transfer? If the answer is yes, you're usually more excited for the person that's there for the transfer. Here, the conversation started by me telling Susan that I read she should eat some McDonald's French fries after her transfer to make sure the embryo stuck. I also added that she should maybe eat a pineapple later that day and make sure she keeps socks on her feet to keep the embryo warm inside of her. Before long, the transfer nurse was there and she called Susan's name. I asked my friend, my new friend Susan, if she could give me one more thing because she had already given me something, which was being there, the encouragement of just being there. I asked her if I could just say a prayer for a successful transfer for the 2 of us. I held Susan's hand. Susan held my hand. The transfer nurse stepped between our husbands and held their hand. And we started to pray. I often wonder what happened to my friend's journey of the IVF transfer. Our transfer was not successful. However, we still have 4 embryos stored in a clinic 1,000 miles away. Yes, I am 48 years old, and I still should have a choice if I want to go back to that IVF clinic. This should always be my choice. This should be anybody's choice, no matter what. Women should have complete autonomy over their body. Thank you for listening to my story.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing, Tracy. I spoke with another woman recently, and I heard this often in the NPR coverage, that women are not accustomed to sharing these stories. They're very private, very personal details, as Tracy said. And this one woman said, in fact, that there were taboos against talking about IVF reproductive stories. And I wondered if at that point in time, if we need another Me Too moment for talking about our reproductive journeys, in order to kind of begin to bring about change about this topic. So, but anyways, I salute you and we appreciate you. We appreciate you. Dr. Malizia, Beth Malizia, can you unmute yourself? Dr. Malizia was recruited by Kristen Resnick of HIVE. And I heard you on an NPR interview. There was a lot of media in town in February, and you were fabulous. I was so impressed with how you presented your story. Let me tell folks a little bit about Dr. Malizia. She is a respected OBGYN, specializes in infertility and reproductive surgery. She welcomes patients with a range of issues, including infertility, irregular periods, fibroids, and pregnancy loss. She's on a national listing of best doctors, and she was among the physicians who lobbied to reopen the IVF clinics here. Dr. Malizia, you probably understand Tracy's story better than anyone, or better than most people. how did were you surprised at the court ruling, and how did that ruling affect your clinic and your patients?
Well, the Friday that the judicial decision came out, it slowly made its way into the world. And by Sunday afternoon, we had read the 131-page judicial decision, which is, if you haven't read it, really intense, but really was very specific to IVF and many portions of it. So we got concerned at that point and called in lots of friends and experts, our physicians, our lab director, a reproductive lawyer in New York, several other folks who were more experienced in terms of what does this actually mean for us. So we were surprised by it. We didn't know that this was a case that had made it to the Alabama Supreme Court. We have subsequently gotten way involved and don't expect that we will have anything that makes it to the Alabama Supreme Court or to legislature without us knowing about it in the future. But this made it there and was intentionally kept kind of quiet. We made the decision as a clinic several days after that to pause some of our treatments. We do lots of things, as Tracy sort of alluded to, in our practice, and we see lots of patients from many different backgrounds, but for patients specifically doing IVF, we chose to put a hold on embryo thaws for transfer, which is what Tracy was going through and her friend in the clinic in New York. And that was for the presumed risk to both patients and ourselves in our laboratory for a sort of unknown, now open bag of possibilities of what could happen. So we put that pause on that treatment as well as sort of new IVF stimulations. We did continue patients through that were already in IVF stimulation. It's not safe for them to stop treatment at that time, and continue to do all of our other routine things, but dove ourselves sort of headfirst into some legislative activity to try to figure out a fix. And probably the most important thing that happened through this, and Tracy's story is so poignant with this, is that fertility patients don't share their journey with a lot of people. They're quiet. They many times don't even tell close friends or family what they're going through. It is extremely stressful to even step foot in our clinic, let alone have to be going through medical treatments and IVF care. So the fact that these patients, 300 of them, showed up at the State House, we were there for 3 days, 1 week, and well, 1 day, 1 week, 2 days the next, sent 32,000 emails. It was unbelievable. And without that push, this would not have happened. Courtney, I know you were involved in many of these discussions. We had just a grassroots organization that popped up from this, Fight for Alabama Families. This was organized over a weekend with the help of lots of people, including Resolve, which is a national fertility group, support group, and Courtney in the background as well. But lots of people, all around sort of offering support. It was extremely important to have everyone on the same page. So the fact that doctors were able to present ourselves with our patients to say, this is not okay, and this needs to change. Something I can say a little bit more freely here in this environment is that the original plan to redefine an embryo was bypassed for an immunity bill. And the feeling was that it was safer and more effective to simply get that portion of it passed. We have not yet answered the question that the judges posed or really defined with an embryo as a child. So we remain a little bit still, I think, open to see where this is going to go and remain to stay involved. But to go back to Tracy's story and just how important the patient voice was in this to get this changed and get us back to work. So we are now back to, as of a couple of weeks ago, doing our full IVF care. We are back to transferring embryos, thawing embryos, doing our routine things. We are modifying a couple of things in the laboratory at this time to just, again, stay safe for our patients and ourselves, but we are at least happy to be back to our routine care.
Thank you. That's a good explanation. It sounds like the effort with the Resolve, the National Infertility Association, and their Fight for Families efforts was probably a model for protest and change in Montgomery.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, Corinne O'Brien is a patient. She happens to be a lobbyist, so she has a lot of expertise in this area. But this one single patient sent emails to friends who sent emails to friends who sent emails to friends. And that happened the minute this started getting out there. A partner and I were on the news that Monday. This sort of blew up in the media. The media was hugely helpful in this case. I mean, obviously the coverage was a little bit all over the place, but as one of my other partners, Dr. Mamie McLean, and I were on everything we could possibly get on, and the national conversation. And this was also hugely important to sort of get this pushed through. But, you know, we sort of reached out to Resolve for help about a week in, but this was already down the course, and they helped us with some of the logistics of, let's get a logo, let's get some t-shirts, let's get, you know, and Barb Calora, who's the president of that organization, was fantastic and jumped in, you know, just in the deep end with us, and just, what do you need, how can we help? And so to see that, but this originated from a single patient reaching out to more patients and more patients, so it just exploded from there. And I think, you know, I would not desire to go back and do this again. Necessarily, it was a lot of sleepless nights for most of us here. And the patient phone calls were they were just heart-wrenching to call patients and have to say, hey, I really want to get you pregnant, and you really want to be pregnant, and I have your embryo right there, but I can't thaw it out because I don't know what that means if we happen to be in the 1 or 2% risk that your embryo doesn't survive that process. I don't know what that means for you. And I don't know what that means for us or my laboratory. So those patient phone calls were horrible, but several of the patients, the specific patients that I had to call and postpone or change their treatment plan, then showed up at the state house to walk around and go from legislator to legislator. These are not advocates. So these are regular people who are just living their lives, who are not actively involved, as many of you guys are on this call on a daily basis with advocacy. These patients, in many cases, they're not advocates. And so for them to share their story, tell their story, show up, send the emails, make the phone calls, show up at the State House. I mean, again, it is such a fantastic sort of representation of what we, you know, as a people can do in terms of our voice. So I was just overwhelmed by that, and am happy to see that. So Resolve was very helpful. Lots of organizations were super helpful, but these patients were just the drive of this, and what got us all out, continuing to get out of bed and face the day of, you know, ran media calls and seeing patients and jumping on all the things that we were doing at that time.
Wow, sounds like a Herculean effort, and certainly an inspiring story. So just one more question to you, and not to put you on the spot so much, but it occurs to me that the underlying law that we have with the court ruling, combined with the 2018 amendment, combined with the loss of protections at the federal level due to the Dobbs decision, could potentially threaten IVF in Alabama in the future. And then I also worry about the tragic situation of one of your IVF patients miscarrying in Alabama, and we are hearing stories about the personhood movement and life at conception movement, whatever you want to call it, impacting miscarriage care. So it's just, to me, as it's seeming like that women need to have access to the full continuum of care. Whereas in the past, maybe women have been divided or on procedure. And this, I support this procedure, maybe not this procedure, but are we beginning to see that we need access, that these laws inhibit a continuum of reproductive care?
Yeah, I mean, I do not have any law. There's probably lots of folks on the call who have much more law experience than I have. I do agree with you that, I mean, the Dobbs decision just sort of blew a door open in the world that we're now in terms of what does this mean? And I think the concern that a lot of the national organizations have is, we've managed to get this at least where we can continue our little piece of care in Alabama for now, but this obviously sets up a whole other realm of possibilities that are out there, not just within Alabama, but for other states as well. So yeah, I agree. I think it's very uncharted territory, and something that feels extremely counterproductive for women's health.
Thank you so much. We are lucky to have you in Alabama. Very lucky to have you. Okay, we're going to move to another person I think we're lucky to have, and that's Representative Neil Rafferty. Neil, are you on the call?
Hey.
Yeah, I heard Neil speak a couple of weeks ago, and I think on several issues, but on this issue in particular, he was really, really well informed. And I realize now that Neil is, as you may know, is a representative in the Alabama State House. He's a Democrat representing House District 54, and he sits on the Health Committee. So he was pretty much at ground zero for the lawmakers that were trying to come up with a legislative fix for this IVF crisis. A little background on Neil.
Thank you.
Neil is an UAB graduate. He's a former Marine corporal, a longtime LGBTQ plus advocate, and he's also the co-sponsor of a bill to protect contraception, which I think has advanced out of committee this week. And so one of the things we want to find out from Representative Rafferty is why he's concerned about contraception. So, but let's start with the SHIELD law, Representative Rafferty, that allowed the clinics to reopen by granting immunity to both the clinics and the client or the patients. I understand that you view this only as a temporary solution and that it might not withstand a legal challenge. Can you tell us more about that and why that's important?
Yeah, absolutely love to. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Great to be joining so many great panelists and all of you today. To kind of talk about that question, as I remember, so this did kind of slowly roll out. I think somebody else had kind of said that earlier. The decision was made. There was some buzz about it that the legislators were certainly talking about it, trying to figure out what's going on here. What are the implications going to be? And then the patient the patient appointments started being either paused, delayed, or canceled. And then there was a tidal wave of communication. I think Jennifer, you might have said something about more like a Me Too, people sharing really intimate stories with me and with their other representatives as far as this is the only way we're trying to expand our family. And I was supposed to have a clinic appointment tomorrow, and now I don't know what it is. What's going to happen now? What's going to be the fix here? I know at first, it was very bothersome because we saw it as what it still is the constitutional crisis as far as what's going on here. After Dobbs' decision, we saw the floodgates kind of open there, and see that now that it's all back down to the states, we have this constitutional amendment that talks about the sanctity of unborn life, and that, you know, there should be nothing that should be construed in this law or in the statute that would contradict that statement. So while we have a bill that's a shield law that provides criminal and civil immunity for fertility clinics and for folks that provide goods for fertility clinics, that is just a temporary fix. And we don't know what's gonna end up happening as a result of that, or even if that would uphold kind of the scrutiny of the Alabama Supreme Court if it were to come to it. The fact is now that we have a whole lot, to solve this issue, we will have to go back to the Constitution to solve it, you know, for good, particularly with this whole range of other reproductive health care options. You know, we're not just talking about IVF care here, we are potentially talking about contraception, or at least various forms of contraception. One thing that the abortion amendment, that the amendment in the Alabama Constitution doesn't do is actually really define when the pregnancy begins. So that leaves open a whole bunch of ambiguity with it. So for instance, contraception that under this kind of ruling with the IVF might be interpreted to be unconstitutional would be the copper ion IUD, for instance, right? So there's a fertilized egg, but it can't get implanted into the uterine lining. So is that going to be something that's on the target next? You know, there's other forms, a plan B, where if, you know, just say the possibility of a pregnancy was there, you know, when is this life really beginning? So there's a lot of different things out there that are up in the air now that used to be constitutionally guaranteed under Roe v. Wade and substantive due process that we've been working off of ever since the early 70s with that. So, and now that that's been undermined by the Dobbs decision and it's kind of been sent back to the states, we're kind of left on our own, and it's kind of the wild, wild west as far as what's going to happen next. That's why I said, you know, that this is a temporary fix. This is a Band-Aid on a hemorrhaging wound, because we do not know what else is going to happen here.
And when you mentioned constitutional crisis, and so the amendment itself is problematic, and it's yes. it's so broad and vague.
Right.
Do you have a suggested fix? I mean, I guess I know some people were interested in the discussion to have legislation that would clearly state that a frozen embryo or an extrauterine embryo is not a person. But right. Then there were others that felt that did not go far enough. It didn't protect a woman, for example, perhaps with an ectopic pregnancy. Right. It might not protect a woman who needs surrogacy.
Right.
You know, there are a host of standard reproductive care that other Americans have access to that look like could potentially be outlawed here. Do you have, so what do you think we need to do to fix this?
Well, right now, when we look at the current 2019 abortion law, and we see that it could end up undermining a lot of the provisions in there that were supposed to protect women from if the pregnancy became life-threatening. Now, see, that wow. might be up in the air now as far as where if those women are actually protected, or if they have to carry an ectopic pregnancy through to course, because as they start trying to figure out exactly where this unborn life it begins or through a legal interpretation and not through the really complex, nuanced bioethical implications of it, but through kind of this black and light, you know, ideological lens, then we could start seeing real problems with that. Now, do I think that that's something that this Alabama Supreme Court probably has an appetite for, particularly after the IVF situation? I mean, I doubt it, but it doesn't mean that the next, you know, round of folks that come up onto the Supreme Court as they're elected out and elected in would not interpret or take what Tom Parker, the Supreme Court Justice of Alabama Supreme Court, have said, and kind of follow suit through there. That's why we were seeing actually a contradiction with the 2019 and 2018 law now, particularly in how the 2018 constitutional amendment was interpreted by Tom Parker. Well, at least in his opinion, in his draft opinion. So,
well, that's pretty sobering. Thank you for that information. It's pretty sobering. I sure hope we don't have to see a woman die from an ectopic pregnancy in Alabama to have to get somebody's attention.
Right. I mean, absolutely, that'd be the real tragedy. That I mean, that I think we need to be proactive as opposed to reactionary. I think right now it's been very reactionary to, as the situation pops up, we're trying to come up with this law to kind of, stop the leak, or the hemorrhaging wound again, and then see where, but as we do that, we might see other leaks and stuff pop up. So without really addressing kind of the Constitution issue here, or without addressing some really more thorough statute to define what unborn life is and isn't, then we could see some issues arise from that. Particularly, I think the thing that we're seeing the closest to would be the contraception issue. And I'll tell you this, the Republicans, some of my Republican colleagues who voted for the IVF bill have been getting postcards, well funded by dark money outside of the state, saying that, how dare you go against pro-life. So we do know that there's extreme elements of the Republican Party or of the right wing that are even trying to target the Republicans who are trying to fix and work through this situation as the crisis kind of evolves. But we do know that there's elements outside dark money that are threatening the Republicans here because they're considered not pro-life enough because of how their position and what they did with the IVF. So I want to say this very clearly, that if that message starts reaching these blood red kind of districts that have been gerrymandered to be, securely Republican, starts catching on, we could see a lot more of my colleagues get voted out and a lot more extremist colleagues get voted in as a result of this. So, I mean, it's more important than ever to be getting registered to vote, getting your friends registered to vote, and making sure that they're showing up to the polls. I can't emphasize that more.
And reaching across the aisle to at least talk to moderate Republican women, perhaps, and independents. Thank you so much. Thank you. We appreciate you. Yeah. Let's move. And one note too, and we're going to move to Courtney Andrews from the ACLU, and Courtney maybe can address this too. But when I started researching this, I just went to the web pages of Students for Life and Alliance for Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, some of these groups, and they are quite open about their opposition to IVF and IUDs and surrogacy and hormonal contraception. These groups are quite open about their agenda, and I don't somehow I was shocked that the situation had gotten that far. Not up now. So, but anyways, Courtney, we appreciate you being on the call. Courtney Andrews of ACLU. Can you say hello, Courtney, and we'll get you on the screen. Unmute yourself and say hello. I don't see you on the screen yet.
I'm here.
Okay, great. There you are. I knew you were there with that beautiful piano and the sunlight in the background. We're all envious of your environment today. Courtney we originally had scheduled Courtney. She's Alabama's reproductive rights policy strategist. And she's going to also be covering maybe some points that Allison Mulliman would have offered us. Allison is our legal director of ACLU, and she could not be here. I heard Allison on a podcast recently. She's fabulous. So we will circle back around to her. Courtney, let me tell you a little bit about Courtney. Courtney is a graduate of the University of Alabama and has a PhD in medical anthropology. And she recently wrote a column actually on this IVF and reproductive rights issues, and has the idea that maybe we need to revote on this amendment. And I want to come back to that question of revoting on this amendment. But I first wanted to ask you, I know you were involved with the protest and Fight for Families and Resolve in Montgomery, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that citizen response there is a model for how we might be able to affect change on other reproductive health issues?
I think so. The outpouring of support that we saw for, you know, an IVF bill was really amazing. Like Dr. Malizia said, Corinne O'Brien got to work immediately, putting out a petition to go around to lawmakers to address the issue and protect IVF. Once I got in touch with her, and Corinne really was the perfect person to lead this effort because she's an IVF patient. She understands really well what's at stake for her family, and for so many families in Alabama. She's also a lobbyist, so she knew kind of how to navigate the legislature. And then, of course, Resolve reached out. They were really helpful. I was a little bit hesitant at first with like a national organization coming in. You know, this happens in Alabama sometimes. They take over. Alabama lawmakers don't love that, but Resolve was great about playing a very supportive role. They were really helpful in mobilizing people, getting the word out, you know, getting people to email and call their legislators. Dr. Malizia mentioned there were, you know, over 30,000 emails that were sent. We had hundreds of people show up to the State House. And I do think it's a model for, you know, expanding and protecting reproductive health services more broadly. And I will say that, you know, I think in the case of IVF that there was you know, a whole new subset of people that were activated around this crisis, but I think that really understand what's at stake for the future of women and the future of families in Alabama if we don't address the root issue here, which is fetal personhood.
You know, it's interesting too. I was on the Resolve website, and they had been warning patients about possibilities like this since the fall of Dobbs. So I think women who are really involved with the fall of Roe, since Roe was overturned and we had the Dobbs decision, I think people thought that Roe simply outlawed abortion, but what we're finding it now was because it was decided on privacy, because the woman had the right to make these reproductive health decisions like abortion, but other reproductive health decisions in the privacy of the doctor's office with her doctor, that people thought that Roe was just about abortion, but it protected all of these other reproductive health decisions. So that is I think that's an important thing that we're just now all realizing or coming to see. And you know, it's interesting you say fetal personhood, and that is and a term that I've heard used, but it strikes me that perhaps in Alabama that we have embryo personhood, and so really if personhood and almost personhood in general, and even I guess these 6-week bills that we hear about are embryo personhood bills, and not to mince terms, but it's just that the goalpost has been moved from any ethical discussion about fetal viability to embryo.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, Alabama's abortion ban, you know, enshrines personhood rights from the moment of conception.
Yeah. So anyways, this column that I read, I think that you wrote was amazing, and we will include that in our next newsletter to everyone. But in this column, you said it shouldn't have surprised us, this court ruling from Alabama. And even though the lawmakers said it was unintentional, you felt like it was intentional, and that they're not done yet. You said everything in this ruling could be used to outlaw hormonal birth control, IUDs, and to criminalize miscarriage. Can you talk a little more about those concerns?
Yeah, well, I think Representative Rafferty brought this up, you know, and you mentioned the Heritage Foundation and some of these organizations that really have you know, had a long-term game plan to, you know, roll back some of these reproductive rights. Roe was premised on privacy, which, if you remember, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you know, said was, you know, made it more vulnerable to attacks. You know, she lamented that it was not premised on equal rights for women, because she thought the privacy protection just wasn't as strong. I think when Alabamians voted for the constitutional amendment in 2018, it was largely considered non-operative text, because you know, we had the federal protections for abortion, and I don't think anybody really foresaw you know, this idea of sanctity of life extending to frozen embryos or to any embryos for that matter. And so, you know, but I do think that this is part of a concerted effort that has been ongoing for a long time. The fetal personhood movement, I think, has largely operated in sort of this realm of abstraction for so long. They really rely on this kind of, you know, using like outlandish hypothetical examples of what could happen, right? They frame it in kind of religious, moral language that makes people feel like they occupy some kind of moral high ground if they, you know, support the rights of a fetus or an unborn child. But I think what's happening now is that we're seeing, since the Dobbs decision, we're seeing that ideology come into conflict with what people need and want in their lives. And when that happens, you know, it's really kind of exposing this fracture in the fetal personhood movement and this you know, through line that's kind of connecting all of these different aspects of reproductive care. And people are starting to say, wait a minute, this is not what we meant by this. This is not what we wanted. And so as these consequences really land in people's daily realities, they're starting to reject it. And we've seen, you know, pretty much every opportunity that voters have had since the Dobbs decision to vote on reproductive healthcare access, they have voted for it in some capacity. And so I think we'll continue to see that. And I think that's why, as Representative Rafferty mentioned, these attacks are coming from the right. They're ramping up this extremist language, you know, and really trying to ensure that they can continue to exert this control over, you know, lawmakers and the courts, because they're, you know, they're not done yet.
Let's talk about your idea that Alabamians deserve a revote on this constitutional amendment.
Yeah. So, you know, there's some polling that came out recently that shows support for this. This polling was done sort of right after the IVF crisis started, before the law was passed. It was with GOP primary voters. So, and this was, you know, just GOP primary voters in Alabama, and, you know, 70+% identify as pro-life. But we're still seeing the vast majority of these voters, I think because the context has changed and because they better understand the extent to which this interpretation of the constitutional amendment can reach and can affect their lives and the things that they need for themselves and their family members. They are largely supportive. I mean, 2/3 of GOP voters are supportive of a constitutional amendment that would allow voters to weigh in on this issue. So, you know, this would be something to protect IVF services, and to redefine a minor child to not include embryos. So there is a lot of support for that in Alabama. The problem is that Alabama doesn't have a citizen-led ballot initiative. So it would take 2/3 of the legislature to get that, back on the ballot for voters to re-vote on, now that they better understand the consequences. And again, I mean, I think that's, I think that it's going to be difficult, but as we see these attacks ramp up from the right on, very conservative, very pro-life lawmakers, and we also see a continued support from, pressure from IVF patients and doctors and people who, support access to reproductive rights. They're going to continue to put pressure on lawmakers. And so I wonder if maybe there's an opportunity for them to just kind of say, okay, the easiest thing to do here is just put it back on the ballot, let the voters re-vote on it, and go, let them decide and sort of, take it off their plates to try to figure out how to deal with it. I know it sounds like a really heavy lift, but to me, it seems like, maybe the best path forward.
Actually, just putting the same amendment back on the ballot, or
I mean, I kind of think so. I think if they try to haggle over the language and redefining different classes of life and all of that stuff, I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think if they were to say, let's do it, let's just redo it, now that the context has changed. There
is no scientific consensus on when life begins. There is scientific and medical consensus on a range for fetal viability, 20, 23, 25 weeks, but there's no consensus on when life begins. So this is a religious view. Now controlling women's medical issues. So anyways, thank you so much. That helps to know that we may have more work to do, and it sounds like if they just put the same bad amendment on the ballot, that might be an easy out for them, and that would also give us broader range of protections for getting better legislation that would cover, for example, the case I mentioned where a woman who gets pregnant via IVF, then later needs a surgical. Needs a miscarriage and needs a surgical abortion, and we're just starting to hear really concerning stories about women being denied care for miscarriage and emergency pregnancy care. So,
yeah, and I will also just say one more thing. I really appreciate Representative Rafferty, all the other lawmakers, for their urgent response to the IVF patients and to that situation. But I want us to always remember, right, that IVF is just one aspect of reproductive health care, and Alabama has a maternal mortality crisis. This is the most dangerous state in the whole country to be pregnant and to give birth. And of course, Black women and Black babies are at much higher risk than white women and babies. So much of Alabama is a maternity health care desert. So fewer than half of the counties in the state offer any form of obstetrical or gynecological services. You have women driving over 100 miles to get to the nearest labor and delivery unit. And this is largely because lawmakers have refused to support the healthcare infrastructure that we've had in the past. They have not expanded Medicaid, which makes it impossible for these rural hospitals to stay open. They haven't allowed birth centers to open or midwives to practice at their full scope. So I think there are a lot of things that lawmakers can be doing to really address this maternal mortality crisis more broadly. And in the process, of course, protect, fertility treatments as well.
And maternal health across the range. Thank you. That's the big picture. Thank you for summing that up. We appreciate you. But with two more speakers, and our fifth speaker is Tabitha Eisner. Tabitha, are you on the call? I saw you earlier. You can say hello.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Tabitha is an adoptive parent from Montgomery, Alabama, a client manager for a software firm, a former Democratic congressional candidate in Alabama, and vice chair of the Alabama Democratic Party. And Tabitha, we all agree that women's health care should not be a partisan issue, but it very clearly is today in Alabama. And I feel like that if we ignore that, we're not going to be able to make the positive political changes that we need to get to the point where we have access to a full range of maternal health care for women, the kinds of care that Courtney was just talking about. So I'm going to ask you some political questions. So is there a little history on this amendment, this personhood amendment that we have? You ran for Congress in 2018, I guess in the 2nd district, I believe. And that's when they put this amendment on the ballot. I think the 10 Commandments amendment was also on the ballot that year. Do you know why they pushed this amendment so hard? And do you think that voters who voted on it really had a sense of what it might mean for their reproductive care?
Yeah, so I think the GOP saw better than we did the direction that things were heading, and they knew that people were going to be far more willing to vote against abortion when they were voting in theory than voting in reality. And so they were able to change the law when the stakes were low. And that was an evil genius move for them. But I think one of the mistakes that we have made is that we've told ourselves that the arc of American politics is long, but it always bends to the left. And, you know, over the long haul, it has. America has become more open and accepting and progressive. But we have and I think particularly white women have underestimated the backlash that is happening on the right. So our hard-earned rights and the rights of other historically oppressed groups are not guaranteed, and we need to stop pretending like those are settled. We thought Roe was settled law, and it wasn't. I readily admit I was one of those people who thought there's no way this can happen. And I'm not going to make that mistake again of thinking that these are firmly established rights that we no longer have to fight for. We do have to keep fighting.
You know, in terms of firmly established rights, I mean, when you have to get permission from your attorney general that he won't prosecute you on a reproductive health matter, that's not exactly, yeah, there's no permanence. There's no permanence there. Let's look at, as I said earlier, I went around and just started looking for the groups that, I think it was an article in the New York Times that listed a couple of groups that had been lobbying here in Alabama. And I assumed they were around in 2018 when the amendment was passed, or in 2019 when we got a pretty strident anti-abortion bill. But as we see, these anti-abortion bills are not really just anti-abortion bills, they're personhood bills, which are multiple reproductive health services. So I almost got a sense that these powerful lobby groups, Heritage Foundation, Students for Life, Alliance Defending Freedom, were making Alabama kind of a laboratory for right-wing ideology. Is that too cynical of a take?
I think it's probably too generous of a take. A laboratory would indicate that they intend to see how it goes and make decisions based on the data. And I don't think it's a laboratory. I don't think they intend to make science-based decisions about how things go. I think that they have been very serious about rolling back women's rights for decades now. And they've been patiently trudging along, making incremental changes, stuff that sometimes seemed too small to make a fuss about. And there's a lesson there that we need to learn as progressives, that all of these incremental changes add up. And so rather than pursuing the whole shebang every time we go to the polls or every time we propose a bill, they were able to do a lot of damage by making small incremental changes. And we need to take that, we need to learn from that example. Also keep in mind that this is related to other issues that the right is pushing. So, they're pushing a wide variety of issues aimed at reinforcing harsh gender norms, and gender norms that they are rewriting day by day. But those are coming out in the form of anti-trans bills, anti-drag bills, anti-DEI bills, anti-gay bills, anti-freedom of speech bills, like what's happening in the library. It's also related to the push to undermine the value that we place on expert opinions. So, they have been working to undermine the value of educated folks, of education in general, so that we can't point to doctors and say, doctors say this is more complicated. They want to push the notion that no, your personal opinion based on your personal life experience is just as valuable, so that you'll be okay with ignoring the advice of professionals. But
Wow.
I think that is a compelling thing for us to remember, as particularly as Democrats, is that my liberation is wrapped up in your liberation, and your liberation is wrapped up in mine. So we can't say I'm just going to be a one-issue voter. We have to recognize that the Democratic Party wins, and progressive values will win only when we stand up for one another. Even when something isn't maybe personally affecting us. I'm an adoptive mom. I have no idea if I have fertility issues. I've never tried to get pregnant, never wanted to be pregnant. I adopted and skipped all that. But I don't get to sit back and say this isn't my issue. This is my issue because it has to do with my rights as a woman, and it has to do with your rights. And if I don't stand up for this, then you're not going to be there to stand up for me when something that does more personally affect me is being considered. So I think this is a great reminder to all of us about the power of alliances to protect one another and to protect vulnerable people, even if they're not people we know personally, not things that we experience personally.
Thank you. Thank you. That is powerful. And I think on the IVF issue in particular, that the telling of the stories has helped people and I was talking to a liberal progressive woman friend who, when I was talking to her about the IVF crisis, said, well, do we really need to be doing that? Having babies in microscopic tubes or dishes. And I said, wait a minute, stop. This is not about that. It's about whether you would want to have the freedom to create your family, or you want the government to make those decisions.
Right.
But it surprised me how quickly my progressive friend was, because she had never had any experience with IVF. So that brings us back to the storytelling that we're hearing and we're doing, that Dr. Malizia heard, and that Courtney heard, and that Neil heard down at Montgomery. All of these stories are making a difference, because I think it helps us bond, and we understand that we are in this fight for women's reproductive health and maternal health together.
Yeah, and Jennifer, just to add to what you're saying, I think this is an opportunity that exists for there to be a broader, less partisan sort of discussion around maternal health. And I think that, as physicians, we are talking to our patients all day long about these issues, trying to stay as apolitical as we can, but to talk to them about how do they feel, what are their concerns. No one is sort of comfortable inherently with the idea that there's eggs and sperm and embryos in my laboratory. It's a strange concept. And so we all recognize that people, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, feel differently about what this means. What are these definitions? How does this define, where are they going to define what an embryo is and what that means to them? So that's a discussion we have all the time with patients directly in the office. And one of the things that, Representative Rafferty mentioned and is that we want to provide that sort of honest conversation. We want to provide education to people across the spectrum about, yes, I'm going to be very specific about what I'm doing, but as you've all mentioned, this is obviously part of a way bigger conversation. But we want to know, I want people to know that the physiology behind this process. What do women's bodies do? I mean, half the women I see in my clinic don't even know how their bodies work. And so, you know, what can we give? What can we provide, you know, as a medical community to, you know, to you all, to the representatives and the senators, to patients, to anyone who's sort of involved in this process, to help them at least understand what the process is? Because seeing that there was a large Christian patient support group involved in our lobbying efforts. And so, you know, this can go, you know, again, bring people together. And if this one single issue can get people involved in the idea of what do these decisions mean for women's health, I think that's hugely powerful, and engage people that maybe wouldn't usually come together about a single issue. So, you know, I agree. I think, you know, there's been little chip away of these things over the years. And I think this hopefully is a little, you know, step towards that. But anyway, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, no, wonderful points. And I would hope that medical education and medical information will begin to trump maybe the ideological arguments, and even trump the scientific arguments, which may be too technical for us. But I think we all understand health and medical decisions. And so getting doctors like you and nurses and patients and people that are out there, medical anthropologists, conveying this as a medical story, I think is critical. And I maybe the answer to the way we kind of come up the middle and bring people together. One quick question, Tabitha, is the tide turning? We had this fabulous election up in Huntsville on District 10 with Marilyn Lands winning a seat. And I say fabulous election, not because she flipped a seat from a Republican to a Democratic representative, but because she ran on reproductive rights, Marilyn did, and she told her own reproductive story about having an abortion for a non-viable pregnancy that would have been injurious to her, and it was a very touching personal story. And then she linked it with stories from other young women today who are not able to get the care they get when their pregnancy becomes an emergency. So is that win for Marilyn Lands in the Huntsville area, do you think that's a sign that the tide is changing?
I don't know that I would say that the tide has turned, but I think the issue is heating up, and I would say that the lines are getting a little bit blurrier, which is a good thing here in Alabama particularly. So we need for more people in Alabama to consider Democrats as someone who they could vote for. And I think what Maryland showed people is that voting for Maryland means that you're going to have more choices on your body, more ability to control your own medical decision-making than voting for the Republican. So I think it's great news, but we have a lot more work to do. So I don't want to celebrate too early on that. I think part of what's hard here is that you know, people are tired of politics and find politics exhausting and overwhelming. And so what they want to hear is a simple position, something like abortion is murder, is easy for a person to understand. It's not true, it's not fair, it's not accurate, it's not compassionate, none of those things. But if you don't want to spend more than 30 seconds on deciding your political affiliation, it's very convenient. We're on the side of complexity. And we always want to talk about it in these very complex terms that, like, well, we're also talking about IVF, we're talking about miscarriages, and we're talking about ectopic pregnancies. Well, now a person has to understand all of those terms, and the average person doesn't. So part of what we have to do, those of us who want to push this, is help make it simple for people again. Abortion is healthcare, as Courtney rightly said in the chat. We have to say, I've had to make hard decisions about my medical, about my body and about what medical procedures to undergo. I bet you have too. You're not obligated to share them. If we want to keep them private, we can. And to give people that opportunity to have a simple way to talk about it, and then let that be the gateway to them considering voting for a Democrat and beginning to shift their views in a bluer direction, in a more progressive way.
Another comment from the chat, pregnancy is a medical condition. It's not a religious condition. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think the more we women talk, I think we have not been talking enough about this, and not just women. The more we people talk about how we have our families, if we can come out of the closet on our reproductive lives, I think the better I think that's maybe some of the best education as well. Let's move to our thank you, Tabitha. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. This was great.
Let's move to our last panelist today. And then as I said, we had planned to go over a little today. We have the Zoom until 1:30. And we are recording if you have to get off early, but there's been some great discussion and questions in the chat, and so we want to get to those. Our last panelist is Elizabeth Anderson, as a 6th Congressional District candidate or nominee for the Alabama 6th Congressional District. Excuse me, I'm getting tired. Elizabeth is a native of Alabama and the resident of the Birmingham area. She grew up living below the poverty line, she says, and she understands the impact that policy choices make on everyday lives. She's a graduate of the University of Alabama, and she co-founded her own technology company, Lunar Lab. Elizabeth, we've asked you to here today, number one, because you're a congressional candidate, and number two, because you've taken a strong stand on reproductive health care. Can you just talk to us briefly about your vision for reproductive health care?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This is one of the areas that I'm really, really passionate about and is a key issue for the campaign. So I'm really excited to talk about it today. So overall, my vision for reproductive rights is to protect the freedom and ability of all women to manage their health and make their own decisions about their bodies. So that means that we need to be safeguarding access to these essential medical services like abortion, birth control, IVF, maternal health care at the federal level. So that's why I'm running for a federal seat. I also want to make sure that this is an intersectional and equitable approach, right? So it cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution because the outcomes are not equal across the board. We have to recognize, like we talked about earlier, that although all women are in danger from these bad bills, Black women, Hispanic women, and poor women who are already facing a maternal health care crisis are really facing a dire situation here, right? So ultimately, my goal is to ensure that no woman has to face barriers when it comes to family planning and reproductive health services. It's that simple. We need full bodily autonomy, and we need the ability to make our own choices. But a holistic and equitable approach also means that we need to expand federal safety net programs to include not just healthcare, but also childcare, menstrual products, services like doulas and midwives. And that's especially important in addressing maternal health care deserts all over Alabama, just like here in my district. In District 6, 6 of the 8 counties in this district are either maternal health care deserts or have low access to maternal health care, including Shelby County, where I live, where we do not have a labor and delivery unit here. So, and as we all know, anybody who's a parent here especially knows maternal and infant health care does not stop at birth. So in addition to protecting IVF and abortion at the federal level, I'm also committed to expanding Medicaid, CHIP, and other wraparound health insurance solutions so that women who are already fighting poverty don't lose their health insurance 12 months after giving birth, which is the current rule for those on Medicaid in Alabama. I think that's totally unacceptable. It also means supporting free lunches, SNAP benefits, the WIC program, which is hugely important in benefiting mothers and babies, expanding some common sense gun laws so that we can protect women from known abusers, and of course, fighting against unfair labor practices around unequal pay and gender discrimination. So all of those things, in my view, are deeply interconnected with each other. They're intersectional issues. And so taken together, I think that we can ensure that women have resources that they need to thrive.
Wow. That's a big picture. I want all of it. I'm struck by 2 facts: that we're still one of 10 states that has not expanded Medicaid, which
Yes.
contributes to higher rates of maternal mortality.
Mhm.
And then I'm also struck by some reading I did that lower rates of fewer reproductive rights are also linked to higher rates of domestic violence.
Yes.
So this taken together with all of the needs that you just expressed just show how much damage this anti-reproductive rights movement is having on women and families in general. You're running against an incumbent. I think he's a 4 or 5 term incumbent, Gary Palmer. I looked at his record this morning. He consistently votes against every reproductive rights measure that has ever come up. He is also a co-sponsor of House Bill 41, the Life Begins at Conception Act. So that's really a federal personhood act. Can you kind of contrast your vision with his?
Yes, absolutely. So like you said, Gary Palmer consistently votes against women's health and bodily autonomy. I don't know about y'all, but that scares the hell out of me, right? You mentioned the Life Begins at Conception Act, which if it became law, it would depict life as starting at conception. It's Fetal Personhood Act. It would effectively ban all abortions nationwide. However, it could also have a chilling effect on IVF as well, because it could be used as a basis to override existing IVF legal protections. And that's just the latest in a long record of working to dismantle reproductive rights. I feel like it's further evidence that the Republican Party is legislating without a plan. They don't care that they're sending mixed signals. One day they support a ban on IVF, the next day that they're claiming that it was never the intended effect. That's what happens when you try to legislate morality, like we were talking about earlier. And it's what happens when we ignore decades of known research and every major women's health organization, medical association. So, where I'm standing on this, I think that every woman should have the ultimate say over her body and her health care. Period. And like I said earlier, it's a holistic issue, which my opponent does not seem to understand. It is incredibly cruel to eliminate access to abortion while simultaneously undercutting the safety nets that would make raising a child in Alabama possible. We talk about being pro-life, but life is not only when you are in the womb, right? Life is a long, long time, hopefully. So we need to have those safety net programs after the child is born as well, and for the mothers. I would not have survived my childhood without those safety net programs. Like I said, I grew up under the poverty line my entire life. This issue is super personal to me. And frankly, it scares me so much that people are turning a blind eye to it. And I'm sympathetic to the other view. We're all in Alabama. I have plenty of family members and loved ones who don't quite see eye to eye with me on this. But, we thought that Roe was settled law. Before then, women died out of desperation. They were performing and receiving unsafe abortions before people really started listening and caring and stood up to enact those protections. So, you can call me crazy, but I don't believe anybody should have to be in that position ever, ever again. And briefly, just not to mention that abortion will never be impossible to obtain for wealthy women, right? They're going to be able to get it. So I feel like it's just one more attempt to control women's bodies, especially women of color and anyone from backgrounds like mine. So my goal is to help build a world where women's health and freedom are non-negotiable. But Gary Palmer seems to be a little bit more interested in controlling women's bodies than saving their lives.
That is true. That is true. One last question. We know that there are some bills in the Congress in Washington today. We know about IVF. We know that Senator Tammy Duckworth and Senator Patty Murray have introduced a bill in the Senate to protect IVF. We know that the Republicans killed or voted against that bill or stopped the progress of that bill. We also know that there is another bill in the House. I think Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania has introduced a bill in the House. She's a Democrat, to protect IVF. I think she's only got two Republicans to sign on to that bill. What would you do on the subject of IVF reproductive care if you went to Washington?
Ooh, so I think that, you know, the fundamental issue with all of this is that the Supreme Court ruled, you know, that a frozen embryo is literally a child in Alabama. And their solution, I felt like, you know, just to kind of go back to the state level, that solution was a stopgap. You know, it doesn't address, you know, the broader issue. It's essentially saying that, yes, an embryo is a child and that certain doctors are allowed to kill them, which feels like some serious mental gymnastics. So I think that that solution has to come from a federal level. We cannot do this at the state level, which is, again, why I'm running at the federal level. So if I'm elected, I am going to work tirelessly to protect abortion and IVF access. I am a realist. I think that you have to be with my background. So I don't want to let Republicans distract us from some of these other crucial issues like food scarcity, housing instability, access to healthcare, and high quality education. I do think that they want us to stay upset and fixated on abortion and IVF and forget that this issue is inextricable from all these other critical things. Even when we are arguing, we have talked several times in this conversation about when life begins, right? I think that's a huge distraction. So when we're spending all of this time arguing about what constitutes a human life, we are tacitly conceding that there's a specific point at which women are no longer legally able to have control over their bodies. So I think we're creating this artificial debate around conception versus implantation versus heartbeats. And that means that we can't stay focused on the fact that this is really about bodily autonomy. So like Jennifer said earlier, it's just constantly moving these goalposts, right? So that is why it's absolutely critical that we enshrine this at the federal level. We have to keep women across our country safe. We have to let people make their own healthcare choices, and we have to put an end to the state level confusion and restrictions, right? So I know that one of the things that we talked about ahead of this call was about, you know, do we trust Republicans to you know, move forward on this issue? And I was thinking about that a little bit, and I feel like the reality is that Republicans have told us what they're going to do by their actions, right? We talked about that IVF bill with Tammy Duckworth as recently as February this year. They blocked that bill to protect IVF at the federal level. You know, Mike Johnson keeps saying that IVF should be protected, but they won't take action to actually do it. They're avoiding it at best, they're voting against it at worst, right? I believe that we should be holding them accountable to their actions. We should be pushing for a federal solution because it is the only way that we can guarantee protections. And y'all, I am a country girl from small town Alabama. With y'all's support, I really think that we can shift the needle of this conversation and we can actually do it and really protect women's bodies once and for all.
Great, great. Childersburg, Alabama. Thank you, Elizabeth, and we wish you luck on that campaign. Let's turn to some of the questions. Shannon, have you got some questions in the chat where we need folks that may want to unmute and put out their question, or do you want to read those questions, whatever works for you?
It looks like we covered so many of the questions. We did talk about, you know, the idea of putting it on the ballot. That was one question, the issue, and we all heard about the hurdles to doing that. I would like to ask people, if you have a question for one of the speakers, please do unmute now. That would be helpful. We've done a good job of doing a whole full circle of discussions here.
I have a question, and it's probably for Representative Rafferty, if he's still here, or Courtney. It's like, is there any desire among the legislator to bring this back? We have had this discussion that it might be easier on them in some sense to revote on the personhood amendment, just because then the pressure is off them. I mean, is there any talk of that happening, or what would be some action items to try to convince this, you know, massive amount of legislators to take this on?
So I think it's really important to put some context here and why the 2018 amendment was even put on the ballot in the first place. Let's keep in mind what happened in 2017. Doug Jones won a special election, and we had a Democratic U.S. senator. So this 2018 amendment, this amendment that was put on the ballot was a Republican scheme to drive Republican turnout to the polls and ensure that they were held onto their supermajority in the 2018 election cycle for all the state elections and the midterms. So with that context and what we're understanding there, it's hard to see that my Republican colleagues would want to put this on the ballot and then drive Democratic turnout, particularly when there's so much hanging in the balance with District 2, Congressional District 2, and and what's going to happen in the U.S. House of Representatives. The balance of power there is hinging on that seat in a lot of ways, which is why this year we've seen particularly a whole scope of this red meat issues enter into the legislature of Alabama. It's not necessarily because these folks really care or are super passionate about it. It's because they're trying to get the red meat ready to prepare for the D2 election. So the RNC is heavily invested in Alabama right now, all the way down to the state legislature and even local level and school boards, like we're seeing with the libraries and this kind of stuff, because they're trying to make sure that they hold on to the balance of power and hold on to U.S. Congress and don't risk losing D2, House District 2 here in Alabama to a Democrat. So I think that's a really important kind of big picture kind of calculus that we have to look at when we're looking at what's realistic and what's not. I could not agree more. I think it was Mrs. Anderson that said, was talking about, shoot, now I forgot what I was going to say, but but she made a really good point as far as, oh my gosh, it totally just slipped my mind. I'll come back to it in a second when I think about it. But I think that if we're looking at this big picture, that it's going to be very difficult to get this on. Oh, the thing that she said was talking about this kind of nuanced debate as far as, or attempt to a nuanced debate as far as where life begins and how it's kind of unnecessary. The thing is that that amendment makes that doesn't clarify when that is. And we saw in early attempts for some of the Republicans' IVF legislation that was coming through, that they were, Senator Melson was talking about, life begins at implantation, not conception. And we saw these kind of little debates as they were trying, as these supposedly pro-life Republicans were really trying to navigate gingerly this debate around IVF and how to solve this issue. Which explains why ultimately we ended up with the SHIELD law bill, because they knew that was going to be a non-starter with Democrats, that if we started getting into those little debates, then we would have real issue then it wouldn't have been able to get passed as easily as it did. So getting it on the ballot. Okay, so there's another big picture item that we really have to think of, and this is federal and this is state level too, and that is the money. Okay, so there is a lot of money that's being pushed out to support these supposedly pro-life candidates and push this out, push these agenda items out. So honestly, I wish we could get it on the ballot. I would certainly be happy to introduce that and to talk about that. And maybe even Maryland Lands, Representative Lands, who's been a joy to work with so far, by the way. I just wanted to throw that out. So proud of her and happy to be serving along her side, to introduce and see if we can at least get the conversation started and start getting it pushed. But like I said, because of the 2024 midterm election, I think that the Republicans, it would just be a non-starter DOA with them. But it's still an important issue, and we still need to be pushing the conversation that way. I just know that right now, our most immediate concern is ensuring that there are pragmatic and actually implementable laws that we could pass, like the contraception protections, in the immediate future. This is the reason why I agreed reluctantly to support the IVF bill. It wasn't because I agreed with the IVF bill or everything that led to the IVF decision. It was because families were suffering. And I wanted to make sure that they were able to get back on track to expanding their families the way they wanted to through and on their own terms. But we all knew that this wasn't going to be a fix. In fact, right now, Tom Parker even looked at IVF and said that, without understanding how IVF works and this other thing that, you can only fertilize one embryo, that one embryo has to go in, and that's just not the way it really works. That's not a best practice. I'm sure Dr. Malizia knows far more about that than I do, so I'm not going to try to step in here and all of a sudden be a medical professional on this issue. But I know that that's a big hindrance as well. So there's a lot of other issues that we're still trying to deal with, but I think that ultimately what would resolve it would be repealing the Sanctity of Life amendment that was put on in 2018, once again in a pre-Dobbs world that was only supposed to drive Republican turnout because they were under threat with the 2017 special election turnout.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you to all our panelists. This has been a fabulous discussion today. I'm so glad we recorded it. Two things: we are watching the mifepristone case in the U.S. Supreme Court and thinking about another panel discussion later this summer, early fall, on that, and maybe looking at the contraception issue more in depth. So hopefully we'll stay tuned, and when we get together on that panel. And also we have an upcoming panel on Tuesday, May 21, another Zoom panel discussion, which is our annual legislative review. We do a preview in January, and we do a review at the end of the session to capture the highs and the lows of the session. So do mark your calendar, and our Zoom calls are always at lunchtime, usually from noon to 1 or noon to 1:30 when we have a great lineup. Thank you so much.